All right, what's up, guys? So back on another segment here. Hopefully, you guys have been enjoying the previous ones. If there's anything you guys would like to hear about or would like me to explain a little bit more in depth, please just let me know. But today, kind of going off the theme of different contractions, I wanted to talk about isometric training today. So what is isometric training? So defined in super training, it's referred to as an action in which the proximal and distal muscle attachments do not move relative to one another. So essentially it means that the muscle is neither lengthening nor shortening. But in actuality, the muscle is changing as there are kind of micro changes in the length, just because of the fact that you're contracting. So isometric training is more so regarded as a constant joint angle or focusing on a specific angle. Isometrics are also typically the point at which an eccentric action becomes a concentric action. So if you look at the figure on the right, that bottom portion is the isometric action of, in this case, a force plate jump. Now, I think kind of going off of what I said in the last presentation, or maybe it was the one before that, typically we as strength coaches, we kind of forget about the other contractions, and we forget the concept that every movement is considered triphasic, to put into Cal Dietz's words, which means it involves three components: the eccentric, the isometric, and the concentric phase. So I talked about the eccentrics because I feel like that's often neglected, but I'm also talking about the isometrics because I think that's also kind of a strength that's underemphasized in strength and conditioning programs. Because if you think about it, the isometric component is very critical for sports performance. So I'll give you an example. A sprinter running down the track, right? As soon as their foot hits the ground, there's an eccentric action to absorb the force that they're putting into the ground. However, there's a short transition between the time that they absorb the force and they produce the force. And that is the isometric action. So I think this diagram that's found in the book Triphasic Training by Cal Dietz and Ben Peterson, I think is a great depiction of each contraction. And you'll see this figure later on in the presentation as I give a little story about it. So what are some of the benefits of isometric training? So one of them is that it's very time efficient. There's a type of what's called overcoming isometrics, is a type of training that's very, let's say, convenient because it doesn't require a lot of time, but it does have a lot of benefits regarding strength. Another benefit is that, let's say if you're an athlete in a weight class, or you're already at your, let's say, a weight that's where you're starting to push the envelope, where gaining more mass might kind of have a negative effect on your performance. So if you're looking to maintain body weight or possibly lose body weight, isometrics is a great way. Again, specifically looking at overcoming isometrics. Now, big benefit of isometric training is that due to the joint remaining in a certain position, there's no joint shearing or tissue gliding, meaning the muscle fibers aren't gliding against or the actin and myosin aren't gliding, which results in less soreness and ultimately a faster recovery. Also, by emphasizing the isometric action or strength, specifically the transition between the eccentric and the concentric portion, you're essentially enabling the athlete to create a faster transition. So think about it in the case with the sprinter. All right, if they're spending less time on the ground, most likely they're going to be running faster. So having that ability to quickly transition from absorbing force to producing force will ultimately allow for greater performances. Now, another big benefit, this is something that I learned in the course, functional range conditioning, that you can emphasize different muscle groups at specific joint angles. So the concept that they use in FRC is pails and rails, progressive angular isometric loading and regressive angular isometric loading. I'm not going to go into depth about it because that's not the point. But what they use with these pails and rails is an isometric contraction in both ends of a length of a muscle, or the length of a muscle. So if you look at this curve, all right, without the arrows, that's typically the tension you can develop at certain muscle lengths. What pails and rails do is it allows you, you essentially put yourself into those, let's say, end ranges. And then by isometrically contracting, you're able to increase your strength or your ability to create tension in those ranges. So that is kind of like it's a way to prevent injuries and kind of a protective mechanism. In that, let's say for the case of the shoulder, all right, you know, sometimes people do not like to, you know, have their athletes press overhead because it's bad for the shoulder. Well, if they're never exposed to, let's say, that range, let's say if they're a football player, they go to catch a ball, well, they just put themselves in that range and they're very vulnerable for injury. So by strengthening just isometrically in that range, you're able to strengthen the tissues and the joint to prevent potential injury if they're put into that position. And then also for the case more so for strength and for performances, by utilizing pauses, which is another form of isometric training, allows you to strengthen that specific joint, primarily because you're exposing the tissues and the joints at that, or you're exposing the tissues at that specific joint for a longer duration. So if you're doing a squat, let's say a normal tempo where you spend half a second in the bottom position, which is typically the portion of the movement where athletes are most vulnerable because it's your weakest position. So if you spend a half a second there per rep, well, simply by adding a 2-second pause, yes, you might have to decrease the load a little bit, but you're getting your body more accommodated to the loads in that position, and therefore strengthening that specific position. So, like, to go back to this graph and to kind of really emphasize the importance of isometric training, primarily for sports performance. I love this story about what Cal Dietz and Ben Peterson talked about, and they compared two different athletes that they had. So they had two track and field throwers. There was Ben and Tommy. Now, Ben was apparently a potentially world-class thrower, while Tommy was more of an average D1 collegiate thrower. Now, although they differed greatly in athletic performance or in their sports, they were using the same loads in training, specifically for the bench press, which was very confusing to Cal, because, you know, he figured that, okay, this guy could produce more power. Why isn't he stronger? So he decided to measure the bench presses using a force plate. And this is what they found. So if you look at the graph, right, Ben is in blue and then Tommy's in red. So Tommy, this has the eccentric action and then the concentric action. But the big difference is that Ben, his eccentric action is much sharper, and the amount of time that he spends isometrically, so the transition between eccentrics and concentric force, is much smaller. So essentially, he's able to produce force at a much faster rate, which allows him to produce more overall concentric power, as you can see at the peak there. So what this shows is that by increasing isometric strength, you're increasing the ability, the athlete's ability to use the absorbed force from the eccentric and use that force to produce it concentrically through, let's say, a jump or a throw. So if you're training two athletes, yes, strength might be an indication, but it's also rate of force development or specific contraction strengths that can be a limiting factor towards an athlete's performance. Some of the disadvantages of isometric training, one is that it can be very taxing on the nervous system, specifically if you're doing overcoming isometrics, because normally it's a maximal contraction for 3 to 6 seconds. If that's the case, it can be very taxing. But there are different types of overcoming isometrics that are more, say, long duration, but at a lower intensity. And then similar to that, overcoming isometrics can be very tough on the cardiovascular system, especially if you're holding your breath during the whole contraction. Because essentially you're not allowing any oxygen to get into the blood. So it can be tough on the heart. And then the main disadvantage of isometric training is that it only really enhances the muscle group at that specific joint angle, plus or minus 15 degrees is what the literature says. So let's say if you're in a sport that requires full ranges of motion, only working a specific joint might not be great. But one of the ways that you can overcome this is by utilizing 3 different joint angles throughout a session. So let's say if you're doing 6 sets, well, maybe the first 2 sets, or you group 2 sets together and you start from the bottom position and work up to a smaller range of motion. So some of the different types of isometrics, I haven't utilized all of them. I'm just kind of giving you or sharing what I've heard of and what I've seen in different books and what I've seen on through other people's training. So there's oscillatory isometrics. So that's basically performing oscillation or oscillatory reps in a specific range. So for example, you take the bench press, you're just doing bench just off the chest quickly, just to specifically load that bottom range. Explosive isometrics are where you produce maximal tension very quickly. So in the case of, let's say, overcoming isometrics, you might push against the pins as hard as you can, but also as quickly as you can. Compared to slow isometrics, where you're kind of building up the tension. So you might put the bar on the pin and then slowly, progressively build up to your maximal tension. Now we have overcoming isometrics, which I'll show a video of later, but overcoming isometrics are simple. You're essentially pushing or pulling against an immovable object. So let's say typically they're done in pins in a rack. So if you have a power rack, you might set the pins where just above the bar. Let's say if you're working the bottom range of the bench, you might set them so they're just on top of the chest, and you essentially just push against the pins for 3 to 6 seconds as hard as you can. Now we have yielding isometrics, where it's more of you're maintaining a position with a certain load. So I like to think this more as kind of like the paused lifting, so a pause deadlift, a pause bench, pause squat. But I've also seen where, let's say you take a maximal or super maximal load, you lower yourself into the specific position you want to emphasize, and you hold the contraction or you hold the position for a longer duration, and then you don't perform the concentric. I haven't used that, as again, that's just something I've seen. Eccentric quasi-isometrics, or I believe they're called EQIs sometimes, where you're basically doing, you're holding an isometric contraction for a long duration, but as fatigue sets in, what you'll notice is that the weight will start to lower itself. So I like to kind of think of this as a kind of as a chest fly. All right. So if you're doing a dumbbell chest fly, you might hold the bottom position, but as you start to get tired, you're going to slowly start to lower the weight. So there's a slow eccentric contraction, but the goal is to fight that lowering of the weight. So there is like an isometric component to it. And then finally, as I mentioned, pails and rails is another isometric technique, or I guess you could say another way you could use isometrics. So I'll show a couple videos here just to give you guys some examples. So let's see here. So the first we got is functional isometrics. Okay, as you see, I guess there's trying to emphasize the mid to top range of the bench press. So you're setting up 2 sets of pins, resting the bar on one set and then pushing against the second pins. But what you're doing is you're performing 4 to 6 reps just within that range. And then on the last rep, you push against the pins as hard as you can. You lower the bar and then you try to complete another rep. So what you'll see in the video. All right. So you see, touches the pins and he comes back down. Purely emphasizing that specific range. Now he's pushing against the pins maximally for roughly 6 seconds. And then the fact that he performed another rep typically is an indication that you could increase the load. Now, here is an example of overcoming isometrics. So the athlete here is in, let's say, a quarter squat, a half to quarter squat position. And he's just going to push against the pins as hard as he can for, say, roughly 3 to 6 seconds. See, he maintains the position. And now we're starting to shorten the range by increasing the height. So it's a very good way of increasing strength specifically in those ranges. Now, just to kind of get one of my favorite lifters of all time, Dmitry Klokov, loved his pause squats. So here's a video of him maintaining position in the bottom. While also including a slow eccentric. So typically what this will do, and it's one of my favorite exercises for improving the squat, is you're basically exposing yourself to a load in that certain position so that you're strengthening that specific position rather than spending half a second bouncing out of the hole. So let's say for weightlifters, if you're catching the clean or the snatch, you want to have a very solid foundation in the bottom squat position. So I hope you guys enjoyed the presentation. I hope you guys start to implement some of the different isometrics. And if you guys ever have any questions, again, as always, my emails are there, my Instagram's there. Please send me a note if you enjoyed it, if you have any questions, or if you'd like me to talk about anything. So again, I hope you guys enjoyed. Thank you for listening. I'll see you guys next time.